2001 was a really interesting year. All of a sudden, Microsoft just showed up and was like, hey, we have a console now. And while a lot of people were like, Xbox, it's not going to be able to beat out the makers of the Nintendo 64 or the PlayStation, I don't think anyone was really expecting Halo just to come out of nowhere and just completely change the landscape of video games. And honestly, Halo 1 definitely proved not only to be a really successful video game, but also, more importantly, a console mover. Xbox was coming in with no experience in the console gaming market, and all of a sudden people had a reason from day one to buy an Xbox so that they could play Halo. Mix that together with the launch of Xbox Live and Halo 2, just expanding on everything that Halo had already had, and it became apparent very quickly that Halo not only had the crown of being the top first-person shooter and a huge asset to any video game console company, but it was also deemed as pretty big competition and the game to beat by a lot of different video game studios over the ensuing years. And honestly, a lot of video games that had released after Halo's launch would attempt to do things better than Halo and try to take a stab at grabbing the crown that Halo had in the glory days of Halo being number one. And honestly, a lot of them failed. A few of them were able to do something cool and establish a foothold in the industry, but a lot of them just straight up failed. Like, for instance, let's talk about Killzone. Most specifically, the first Killzone and Killzone 2. Both of these games somehow got really ingrained in a lot of the conversations about the console wars and which game console had the best exclusives. Xbox had Halo, so what would Sony throw out there to be like, hey, PlayStation's cool too? Well, in 2004, pretty much set directly to compete with Halo 2, also released in 2004, the first Killzone game would release. And Killzone was also really hyped up in 2004. It was heavily anticipated. A lot of publications considered it Sony's Halo killer. It was a first-person shooter game set in the future. It had online capabilities even though it was on the PlayStation 2. It really goes to show how successful Halo was, because even though Sony and the PlayStation 2 absolutely dominated the gaming industry, they still had to make a game that was kind of a direct response to what Halo was doing on this brand new console, the Xbox. So while many Sony loyalists skipped out on Halo 2 and an Xbox to wait for Killzone to release, overall, the reception for the first Killzone game was actually pretty mixed. A lot of people definitely praised the visual and art design and just the general world building and atmosphere that was featured in Killzone. It looks incredibly great for a PlayStation 2 title. The story was a little bit weird, and ultimately the gameplay just didn't quite hit the level of replayability to the masses that Halo had. Now, if you look back and you play Killzone nowadays, it actually could be deemed as a gem to a lot of fans who play this game, but this was a game that definitely had a huge amount of publicity, and it definitely made the expectation way more inflated than maybe what Killzone would be able to even achieve. Still, at the very least, Killzone introduced a brand new IP that Sony could use if they ever had to pull it out again to try to compete head-to-head with Halo in a science fiction first-person shooter battle. They could always develop another game, and when the PlayStation 3 was set to release, Sony went all in with Killzone 2, but this time around, they took a different approach. At E3 2005, the Xbox 360 was already aiming for a release of that year, which would be beating out the PlayStation 3 by an entire year. So Sony knew they had to bring out their big guns to convince people that waiting a year to jump to the next gen would be worth the wait. So they pulled out the Killzone 2 trailer, and it was all pre-rendered and not an actual reflection of what the game would look like whenever it did come out on the PlayStation 3. Now, using pre-rendered graphics to promote a game isn't something that would be unheard of in the video game industry. Sega had been doing it with the Dreamcast for a while, but there was something a little bit sus about showing something for your next generation console and it not actually being a reflection of what the game would be like. So then the development team now had this expectation as to what the game would look like, higher than what was actually likely possible for a PlayStation 3 to do in real time, which meant they would need to put a lot of work into actually developing the game to bring it up to a visual fidelity that at least was somewhat close to what the expectation had already been set to, which definitely ended up slowing down the development of Killzone 2, and also meant that Sony would also have to up a pretty big budget to pay for this game game to be developed. Its budget was originally set at 20 million, but it went all the way up to 40 to 45 million by the end of development. This development would slow things down, and there was no way that Killzone 2 would be ready in time for the 2006 PlayStation 3 release. And matter of fact, the game wouldn't even release until 2009, years after Halo 3 had already released. And at that point, the whole comparison of Killzone to Halo really wasn't even relevant, because by then, Modern Warfare 2 was coming out and people were talking about that. Actually, in an interview, Guerrilla Games director Herman Hulst actually said that they don't like being labeled as the killer of a specific franchise, and elaborated saying that they built it as its own universe to experience in its own right without wanting to benchmark it against any one particular game. And that was a fair statement to make all of these years after that initial CGI trailer was released, which definitely felt like a direct comparison. But obviously, there was much more going on and more moving parts, because this was about the Xbox 360 and the PS3, not necessarily at this point about Halo 3 and Killzone 2. Killzone 2 ended up being a very popular PlayStation 3 game and has a really good reputation amongst a lot of its fans, definitely improving on a lot of the criticisms it had from the first title. Killzone 2 ended up being received very well critically. However, sales-wise, the damage I think had already been done with so many other games out there, especially Modern Warfare 2 coming out that same year. That would be on both PlayStation and Xbox 360. So unfortunately, Killzone 2's sales were under the expectation, though to this day, a lot of people still really love this game, and I'm sure over the years it did slowly regain some of its footing after a slow start sales-wise. So of course, while Killzone 2 was in development, there were other franchises taking swings at Halo though. Matter of fact, after Call of Duty 2 released and was hugely successful, Infinity Ward had a little bit of time to start working on different prototypes for what game would be following up their next Call of Duty entry, because Treyarch would be taking over and working on some DLC and then Call of Duty 3. And while a portion of the Infinity Ward team would be working on updating the engine and working on some World War II prototype builds, another team actually was split off and tasked with coming up with concepts for a sci-fi first-person shooter utilizing similar gameplay that Call of Duty 2 had, which was just referred to as Halo Killer. It's really interesting because it sounds like from various interviews that had popped up over the years that there was this intention to make something more science fiction-y that could go head-to-head directly with Halo, especially with the momentum that Call of Duty 2 had already established. However, during this time period, it seemed like both groups at Infinity Ward, the group working on the World War II project and the group working on the Halo Killer project, were kind of struggling, not having the full team unified working together on something. So instead they came together, and the idea to work on a modern warfare type Call of Duty game was born, and the Halo Killer project and the World War II project were scrapped, and instead Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare would begin its development. And to be fair, while obviously the game wasn't set to compete directly in a science fiction setting, they still probably had the mindset that they wanted to become the biggest first-person shooter in the competitive scene and dethrone Halo, which had been completely dominating online multiplayer. It's kind of weird to think of an era where it wasn't Halo and Call of Duty as the top first-person shooter games when you're thinking the online service time, but yeah, there was a few years of time where it was just Halo 2 and Halo 3 with no real competition whatsoever. Call of Duty 4's release was a huge deal, and the gameplay was really fun, solidifying itself as a top first-person shooter and a franchise that every single Halo release after Halo 3 would be forced to go head-to-head with each holiday season to try to compete with. So Call of Duty may have been able to slide in there and make room for itself with the competitive online multiplayer side of things, but there are also other studios that wanted to slide in there and see if maybe they could get some traction off of a cooler science fiction setting, or at the very least a comparable one, and compete directly head-on that way. Thus, games like Haze and Time Shift and The Conduit would all start to pop up in the late 2000s. Time Shift was the first of these that would release in 2007, and honestly, I don't remember too much about this game. I just remember being at my Blockbuster, looking at the box art of this game, not really knowing what it was or if I should rent it. I never did end up renting it, but I did like the way the helmet looked on the cover, and I feel like that's probably the reason a lot of people ended up buying this game back in the day. Time Shift was a first-person shooter developed by Saber Interactive, which was essentially this science fiction first-person shooter game where you also had the ability to control time, like slowing down, stopping, and rewinding time to some degree of control. This game ended up having a really rocky development. There was a demo that released in 2006, and the demo was just panned terribly. So people were expecting the game to straight up be canceled, but then it was announced that they were going to give it a huge overhaul, fixing a lot of problems with it. There's this cool looking suit, which is the coolest part of the game, and some bad guy named Dr. Crone, which is very on the nose. This game even has it where the protagonist's face is hidden behind the mask, and when we're about to find out who he is, it warns of a paradox and hides the big reveal. So that's cool. I was actually surprised to find out that Time Shift originally had a multiplayer, which honestly in 2007 on Xbox, multiplayer games were the Wild West. So I'm sure some people out there probably had a lot of fun playing this game. However, I don't think anyone was really peddling or arguing that Time Shift's multiplayer was the greatest multiplayer of the mid to late 2000s. The gameplay is kind of interesting. For multiplayer, it kind of looks like Quake, but the multiplayer maps are way too big for Quake, so it's its own little thing here. But yeah, a lot of people definitely did like the multiplayer and thought that it was underrated, but I also think a lot of us have those feelings towards multiplayer games that we played during this time period. Like for instance, I have it with Perfect Dark Zero, which was a launch title for the Xbox 360. They didn't have a Halo game ready to go to release in 2005, so Perfect Dark Zero would fill that gap, giving us a sci-fi first-person shooter experience, and the maps were large, kind of like Big Team Battle, except the gameplay was chaotic. The guns looked kind of cool, but yeah, the gameplay just didn't really snap in the same way that Halo did. Perfect Dark Zero really wasn't that good of a game. Speaking of Perfect Dark Zero, way back during the development of the first Perfect Dark game after the success of GoldenEye, a lot of the main developers ended up splitting off and making the Time Splitter series, which was super successful. And then that development studio ended up making, hopefully, the next Halo killer, which was called Haze. And this game would also end up being a Sony exclusive, which was a big deal. I found an article where they said that since it has one less syllable than Halo, it only having one syllable means that it could be better than Halo. It had online co-op, big team battle support up to 24 players. It was releasing the same year as Halo 3, and this article pointed out that this game could potentially have everything it needs to be the not Halo of another platform. The main character also had, a gold visor, so you know that it was a big deal here. The game would end up releasing, even with the hype of some media sources calling it the potential Halo killer, and it ended up not doing that well. It got like 5 out of 10s everywhere. IGN criticized it for having a, quote, horrible plot, weak gameplay mechanics, and visuals that are truly underwhelming. A lot of players ended up criticizing this game for being pretty disappointing considering how heavily it was kind of peddled to be a comparable game to Halo. And later on, in 2015, The Guardian even nominated this game as one of the 30 worst video games of all time, just pointing out that it was a hollow disappointment and the plot was pretty bad, while also saying the characters were laughable and the campaign was apparently short, even though How Long to Beat has people clocking in around 6 hours, which still is longer than Call of Duty. But hey, if it's a really bad experience, it's a bad experience. Okay, so we've seen this back-to-back between Xbox and PlayStation and Halo and games like Killzone, and then there's the Nintendo Wii, which honestly had a very casual audience, super successful, a great way to make a lot of money. But they knew there was room to maybe capitalize on the hardcore gamer audience that was really starting to grow in the more online space in video games. So developer High Voltage Software decided that they wanted to try to tap into this hardcore market by making a game that could appeal to those players who only have Nintendo Wiis. So this game was announced in 2008 and would try to fuse these motion controls into a competitive multiplayer game, taking inspiration from games that were successful on the Wii like Metroid Prime 2. And this game did have a story mode and a campaign, but it really wanted to push the idea of a multiplayer game. So when this game ended up releasing, it ended up doing okay. It kind of got 7 out of 10s across the board. And interestingly enough, at the time, that was considered the best pure first-person shooter available on the Nintendo Wii. So they did it, I think. Actually, a lot of media outlets compared this game directly to Halo for better or worse. Some media outlets praised it for playing a bit like Halo, and other media outlets criticized it for playing a bit like Halo. The game ran at 30 frames per second, but a lot of the reception was the gameplay was surprisingly smooth for the type of game that it was. And it was even nominated for Best Wii Shooter of 2009 and Best Multiplayer Game of 2009, but it ended up losing to Dead Space Extraction and New Super Mario Bros. Wii. But still, they did something cool, and they ended up making a sequel for it, which came out in 2011, and this time around, they made sure to make their protagonist have a helmet with a visor, because they realized they missed that opportunity in the first one. Also in 2013, The Conduit, the first one, was re-released on Android devices. Could you imagine if we made this whole channel Rocket Sloth just about the Conduit and the universe inside the Conduit instead of Halo? I feel like this could exist in an alternate timeline. Still, an interesting game nonetheless. It didn't kill Halo though. Of course, there was other games that also released and were often compared to with Halo. There was a time where the Crisis games were trying to dethrone Halo, or even Resistance: Fall of Man was supposed to be a Halo killer at one point. Then there were some other games that were a little more uniquely out there. Like for instance, there was Murder Miners, which wasn't really trying to take the Halo audience as much as it was more going after the Minecraft audience, but it used Halo as a marketing device to be like, hey, we combined Halo and Minecraft together, and this weird game exists. I remember playing this game when it released on the Xbox 360 and not really liking it. I don't know, it was just a little weird. It didn't feel enough like Halo or enough like Minecraft to catch my attention, but apparently it's recently re-released. So we played it a little bit, and it was pretty much exactly what I remembered. And then more recently, one game that was talked about to potentially be an actual Halo killer was Splitgate, which recently came to console last year. And honestly, the hype and explosion that Splitgate had in popularity during the summer of last year, it was really cool to see a small dedicated development studio just explode in popularity. And I think a part of that could be contributed to the fact that there had been a big demand for a Halo-like game to finally release again after not having something from Halo itself for 6 years. Now, of course, Splitgate was a free-to-play game, so a lot of people tried it. A lot of people stuck with it, but slowly over time, the game did kind of dwindle off in its player base. But I have a feeling with the current state of Halo Infinite, people might be shifting back to Splitgate as new content releases on that platform. But still, Splitgate was really cool. The game felt, in its core, like a Halo game mixed with Portals from the Portal franchise, and honestly, it was a really cool, unique twist on the game. Now, some people aren't fans of the Portal, but ultimately, I was a huge fan, and I was highly impressed with how the gameplay actually felt, and the fact that they made an arena-type shooter that played like Halo feel as fun as it does. And it got a Forge mode before Halo Infinite got a Forge mode, which should be worth noting. Nowadays, we can look at all of these games that existed, and still, Halo is here at the end, and I think people will always appreciate the legacy that Halo had during the 2000s, 2010s, when Halo was truly at its peak. I think it just goes to show that if Halo is ever going to fall off its throne, it's going to be because it oofs itself, not because another studio comes in and knocks it off of its throne. But hey, if you like this video, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe with notifications on. Listen, if you change your mind, you don't want to be subscribed later on, go ahead, you can unsubscribe later, but take a chance on us. See what we're going to put out next. It could be the best video you've ever seen. It might not be, but it could be, and you don't want to miss that. So you're going to need to subscribe, at least for a little while, to find out what's going on. Also, did you play any of these games back in the day? Which one was the most underrated, or did we miss a game that you felt should have been included in this video? There wasn't a really good place to talk about it, but Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, the campaign side of things feels like a Halo game that never got accepted into the canon. Like, it's pretty good actually, surprisingly, from a story perspective. But yeah, it definitely was an interesting entity that existed in 2016. All right, that's it for today. We'll see you all next time with a brand new video.